The following is an encore presentation of a pre-recorded program. Chats and evaluations were only available during the live presentation. To join one of CJE Senior Life's many live presentations, please visit cje.net/events, call 773-508-1000, or follow us on your favorite social media platform.
Good morning. Welcome to Insights on Aging, understanding why we chase highs. I'm going to allow a few more minutes before we really start the program. I see not too many people have signed on yet. We'll give it a little more time, but I'll go ahead and just start talking about who I am, what CJE is, and then we'll get to the program and introduce Nina. Basically, I'm Roseanne Corcoran. I'm the manager of counseling services, one of the managers of counseling services, and we're the sponsors of these Insights on Aging community education programs. I want to be sure that everyone's aware that we offer counseling services in person, both at our Rogers Park office and in our Deerfield offices. As well, we're doing counseling on telehealth, and we do some limited home visits, and you can do telehealth with a video and or a phone connection. We do provide individual, family, and group therapy, as well as a variety of support groups. And I do want to mention that we have a new treatment model, Pearls, which is a brief treatment model. It's only 8 weekly individual sessions. So if anyone is interested in that and or in our other services, do reach out. We're still following pretty strict COVID protocols in the office. So if anyone's worried about that in an in-person meeting, we're still being very careful. And if you want information on these or other services, you can always contact our intake team. You can call 773-508-1000, or you can reach out to me directly. If there are any professionals in the audience, I want to be sure to mention that we're not offering CEUs for this program. Do be aware that the program is recorded. It will be available on our website later. So if anyone knows someone who's missing the program, there will be a link and it will be on the website. If you provided an email, then we will reach out to you later after the program, and we'll provide a link to that page where the recording will be. And that email will come to you probably Monday, as well as it will include any handouts that our speaker references. We'll pop that in the email and send it to you. Since this recording is happening on the program, we do have higher privacy features in place. You can't see other people who are in the program, and we're going to use the Q&A in order to communicate with the speaker and or to have your questions answered. The chat is disabled. Do know that we have closed captioning enabled on the program, but in order to see it, you have to turn this on your own device. So at the bottom of your screen in your bottom toolbar, you might want to hit CC/live transcript, and then you can adjust for subtitles or for a side transcript view of the conversation. We do encourage you to participate and to use the Q&A to provide questions to the speaker or let us know if anything is not working. I'll be monitoring the Q&A as our speaker is doing her presentation, and we'll address any issues that come up as we go on. So let's get to our program. The title of the program is Understanding Why We Chase Highs. And our speaker is our respected colleague from JCFS Chicago, Nina Henry. Nina is an addiction specialist and a mental health educator. Nina, it is all yours.
Good morning. How are all of you? I'm so glad to be here. I just want to give you a little bit of 411 about me and what I do for CJE and what I do for JCFS Chicago, where I work. I want to right away thank Roseanne Corcoran and everyone at CJE Senior Life for giving me this wonderful opportunity, amongst many opportunities I get to be with the participants in their services at CJE. And of course, all of you who are joining us today. Just really briefly about myself, I've been in the substance use and mental health treatment fields for over 30 years. I used to run a program for a little over 19 years that served clients that have had both substance use problems and mental health problems. So I hope that adequately qualifies me for today's program to present it. I also want to thank all of you because you gave me the opportunity to really get current on this particular topic, which is we're going to be talking about something called non-substance related disorders. And I'll get more into what that is and how it's defined. But it is about addictions that have nothing to do with substances like alcohol, cocaine, heroin, fentanyl, etc. And the other thing I want to let you know about, and probably at some point before the end of the program, Roseanne will tell you how things wrap up and what you'll receive it via email and so forth. But one thing I want to be sure is that you know that I do something called information and referral. So perhaps while I'm speaking today, something will come up like you'll say, oh my goodness, a friend of mine seems to have this problem that Nina's talking about. And having my name and my phone number and my email will give you the opportunity to contact me confidentially and find out how you can help your friend or your spouse or your significant other, whoever it is that you're concerned about. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so you can see the actual program that we're going to be participating in today. And let me bring that up. There we go. So hopefully you can see this. Rosanna, let me know if you can't. So I'm going to go past this title screen and go right to what our goals are for today. Now, this looks like a lot of goals. I'm actually going to keep it simpler than what it looks like on this slide. But essentially, I'm going to talk about something called a syndemic, and you can maybe even right away guess what that might be. But I'm actually going to spend probably about the first third of today's presentation really kind of talking about what's going on today, especially vis-a-vis COVID, how we're affected, how people are participating in these non-substance related disorders, which as I promised, I'll define more readily for you. So lots of statistics, and then we're gonna do a deep dive into what some of these problems are. So there are things like gambling, food addiction, screen addiction, and there's others, but those are the ones we're going to focus on since we're limited on time. And I don't like to stop at just telling you what the problem is. I like to also talk about the solution. So we'll look at treatment for non-substance related disorders, and then we'll wrap things up, and hopefully I'll be able to get to some of your Q&A, some of your questions for me. So right away, as I mentioned, there's a word called syndemic. And it was actually coined by someone named Merrill Singer in the early 1990s, so before the COVID pandemic ever happened. And the term was developed to call attention to synergistic nature of the health and social problems facing poor and underserved. So I'm going to take it beyond what Mr. Merrill Singer said, or Dr. Merrill Singer, I don't know if he was a Mr. or a doctor, and say that I would say that it goes beyond just people that are underserved and poor and, have, even though I would say, for instance, in the COVID pandemic, that those folks maybe suffered more than folks who were more well-heeled and more well-funded and lived in nicer communities. But the bottom line is lots has been going on over the last 2 to 3 years, right? We've had the COVID pandemic, but in addition to that, and maybe because of the pandemic to some degree, we've had people with financial reverses, we've had people with increasing mental health problems. You maybe have heard about the increase in suicide incidents and the increase in overdose incidents, in particular because of fentanyl, which is an opiate drug that is much more prevalent now than it was prior to the pandemic. So it's this idea that it's like a synergy, like we've got this one pandemic, and synergy means one thing enhancing the other or one thing causing the other. And I would say, indeed, this COVID pandemic has really synergistically sort of brought a lot of problems to the fore. And so that almost everyone can say that they've at least had some anxiety or stress or some sort of mental health difficulties maybe during and because of the pandemic. So that's that for now. Let's move on. Let's find out what the actual, I've talked about some of the impacts, but let's speak more factually about what those impacts have been. So 53% of United States adults reported COVID had a negative impact on their mental health. So that's one of the things I just told you, that more than half of American adults have had a mental health problem that they link to the COVID pandemic. 12% was a report of increase in substance use. So not necessarily substance abuse, but maybe substance misuse or just increased use. So for instance, my nephew's spouse recently told me that they were having a lot of problems with alcohol, which they've never had before, because of the pandemic, because they have 2 very young children and they're shut in the house, that this was really very stressful and that they started using alcohol more. So just to give you an idea, that's just like one snippet, but again, I'm trying to link the addictive or misuse behavior with the pandemic and all that's been going on in the last 2 to 3 years. Now, this is something that kind of blew my mind when I saw the statistic. So there's a 43% growth of the poker industry, and they've actually close to 300%, 255% increase in first-time players during the pandemic. Can you imagine? And that doesn't count the people that are doing all kinds of other online gambling and all the other kind of activities that can happen on the internet, either related to gambling or just social media. So just like a huge mushrooming of this activity. And finally, and this is something I'll talk at greater length about, how eating disorders and eating, because it's a substance, right? Food is a substance. So how can that be a non-substance use issue? I will go into that, but I just want to kind of alert you to the fact that I will explain that, for any of you who might have questions. But imagine that during the pandemic, 78% increase in calls to the National Eating Disorders Association hotline. So that's rather dramatic increase because of this syndemic, which I'll continue to call it. So I've been using this phrase, non-substance related disorders, and it actually is a relatively new category in the diagnostic statistical manual that professional clinicians like me use. I'm a licensed clinician, a licensed clinical professional counselor. And when I am diagnosing a client or consumer, I'm going to use this manual to determine if the signs and symptoms that I'm seeing in the individual that I'm assessing might have some problems. So a new disorder that's in a new edition of the diagnostic statistical manual is this non-substance related disorders. And interestingly, as I said, these problems are not related to substances, with the exception of food, which I'll talk about later, right? So these are disorders that have to do with things like gambling, and really gambling is the only one that really shows up in this manual that I'm talking about, and eating disorders do, but for instance, internet addiction isn't showing up yet, though it's under investigation. There is such a thing as sex addiction. There are sexual dysfunction disorders that are contained in the manual, but not all of them sort of have an addiction component related to it. So I'm not even going to do that because that's very complicated. I won't even be talking more about that. But essentially, these are addiction-like problems that have to do with things that are not substances like alcohol, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, etc., marijuana, and so forth. So continuing the definition using some statistics in this case, or no, actually no statistics just yet. So the person struggles with the mental health or physical issues as a consequence of the behavior. So the most important marker really for any kind of disorder is that it interferes with someone's normal functioning. So if someone is having physical health issues by virtue of their gambling, as an example, or if they're having a mental health issue by virtue of their internet engagement or their eating disorder, their eating problems, then we can say that this activity, this non-substance related activity, is interfering with normal functioning. And that pertains to relationships, work, how they manage their day-to-day activities. Are they getting in the shower regularly? Are they engaged in good hygiene? Are they seeing the dentist and the doctor on a regular basis? Are they taking care of themselves? Because a lot of times people engaged in these non-substance related disorders put those things aside and spend the lion's share of their time engaged in this problematic activity. Again, negative consequences. So maybe they owe a lot of money because they've gambled more than they actually have in the way of income, or maybe they actually engage in some sort of illegal kind of gambling activity or illegal internet activity. And so they might actually end up having, or just consequences like their kids are not being paid attention to, or their spouse or significant other is angry with them because they spend so much time engaged in these activities. And despite repeated attempts and despite the consequences, they can't seem to stop the behavior. And this, of course, is indicative of substance use related disorders, just as it is for non-substance related disorders. So the person, try as they might, they really have a hard time stopping the activity. And I'll explain a little bit about how that happens in the brain, that actually their brain tells them, you can't survive unless you're doing this thing, right? And we'll see how that goes, but they literally think they can't survive unless they continue gambling, continue eating the way they've been eating, continue to do the internet activities. And what you'll find as I begin to review each of these disorders is that there's some very specific qualities for gambling versus eating behavior versus, like they all have sort of a specific pattern and a specific look. In other words, there's things that are similar about all of them. They're all like an addictive process, but they also have specific characteristics. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. So a little bit more in the way I told you I was going to show you some more statistics. So this actually was from the United Kingdom. So not everything that I'm talking about is confined to the United States. Obviously, we live in this country, in this society, so that's what we're most concerned about. But it's ubiquitous, right? The pandemic has been a worldwide problem and it has worldwide consequences. And so as you can see, looking at this, that people increased their engagement in gambling activities over the duration of the pandemic. And some said they gamble about the same as before. Some people say less, but close to 40% say that they're gambling more than they did before the pandemic. And that's, again, in the United Kingdom, not here in the United States. And also you might notice the data is largely derived from the years 2020 and 2021. And you must be thinking, well, it's nearly 2023. Isn't this old data? Yes, I can't deny that, except that the way research and data often works is that it takes a while, especially if you've got a good sample of people involved in these research projects. It takes a while to collate the data. So something that's been collated in 2018 and 2019 may not even be seen until 2020, 2021. So this is pretty current stuff. I feel pretty confident I'm giving you current data. And I love this. I actually found a slide that talks about older adults in our state, in the state of Illinois. And you may be surprised to find out that nearly 6% of Illinoisans that are over the age of 65 are at risk for a gambling problem. And that's just gambling. That's not the eating disorder stuff, and that's not the internet stuff or any of the other non-substance related disorders, just gambling alone. That's a large percentage, 6%. And and it also suggests here that there's some different reasons that people report for why they engage in gambling. It's understandable to imagine that people may be feeling lonely and isolated, find that if they get online and they're gambling or playing poker or whatever, that they're actually engaging with other people, even albeit online, right? They're not in the same room, but they feel more connected with other human beings, and that might be why they're actually engaging in these activities. Unfortunately, for close to 6%, it kind of snowballs into something that's problematic and affects their functioning, their health and mental well-being. So just a little bit more in the way of statistics, and then we're going to move on to, what the heck these things are, what they look like, how you can identify them. But up to 10 million Americans live with a gambling addiction. That's, there's about 365 million people in the United States. So 10 million is not a small percentage. And 6%, this is something that was sort of a surprise to me. Remember, I thanked you for helping me learn all these new things. 6% of people struggle with shopping disorders. So these are people that shop and buy things that they really neither can afford nor do they need. And maybe that's also connected with a hoarding disorder. That's possible that it's sort of a dual disorder in this case, because they buy things they don't need. And then what the heck are they going to do with them, right? Just put them on a shelf somewhere. And it's estimated 25% of internet searches, or 68 million searches daily, are associated with pornography. So that gets to that idea of possible sex addiction. And it's not possible, it's actually a real thing. And 35% of downloads are related to pornography. So plenty of people, like it or not, are really engaged in this particular activity. And 3% of the people who regularly go to the gym. So you might be thinking, okay, how is that a bad thing if they're going to the gym? Like, how is that an addiction-related activity? Well, I'll tell you just a story about a client of mine. I used to work at Evanston Hospital early in my career, and I used to work the graveyard shift, right? I would go in at 3 p.m. and work until 11 p.m. And somewhere one evening, I'm on my shift, and around 7, 8 o'clock after dinner, I hear someone in the group room, and we have an exercise cycle in the group room in those days. And this woman who had things to do and places, that really should have been in her room getting ready for the next day, was busy frantically bicycling. And, we came in and we said, and we were aware that she had some eating issues, right? She likely had something called anorexia nervosa. So we also knew that the exercising had an addictive component to it. She didn't feel like she could just go to bed after a meal. She felt like she had to compensate by using that exercise cycle, so that she said, I can't sleep until I do this a little longer. And we said, well, we're going to, we're going to do some things, maybe, you can take a hot shower or something that'll help you get to sleep, but the exercising for you is off limits. And we actually decided for the duration of her stay that we had to lock up the bicycle, because we were really concerned she was going to wake up even more in the wee hours. And so we were concerned that she was going to be harming herself by exercise. So hard to believe that exercise could be seen as a negative thing, but in this instance it was. And finally, work addiction. So I don't know who I've got on the call with me today. Some of you, maybe all of you are retired, maybe some of you work part-time, maybe you can reflect back on your own work history. I know certainly in my own career, I have bordered on that problem with work addiction, that I just felt like I had to get everything done before I left at the end of the day. And of course, no one, if any of you have worked at any job for any length of time, you know that most times you can't get everything done in a day. If that were the case, you wouldn't have to go to work the next day, right? So, so work addiction, 5 to 10%, that's pretty huge, right? So this is just a slide to sort of give you, sort of a word cloud to sort of talk about all the things that might be associated with the word addiction, and all the kinds of things that might be happening. So you'll see, there's sexual activity, gambling, of course, which I've talked about a lot, definitely drugs, but you see that big word off to the left, bottom left, hunger. One thing I don't like on this slide, because I think it misstates the issue of addiction and substance use and non-substance use disorders, is this idea of habit forming. Habits are not necessarily bad things, right? Having a habit, you can have a good habit, right? You can have a habit of healthy exercise, healthy eating, meditation. You can have habits that are healthful for you. So I don't like to kind of associate habit with the idea of addiction or substance use problems or substance misuse problems. But you'll also see things like severe trauma, behavioral control. So there's a lot of things, abstain, which we'll talk a little bit about. So all these kinds of ideas, and maybe you could add, 10 or 12 to them, but we're going to move on right now. So before I go into what these things look like, I want to talk very briefly about what goes on in a person's brain, particularly when they're having some sort of dependence upon either a substance or, in this case, activities that are not substance use related disorders. So in a normal brain, this is how your brain works. You've got all in your, these are, imagine this as a highly blown up picture of two neurons in someone's brain. Now, you have over 1 billion neurons in your brain, right? So we have lots and lots and lots of these things. And basically, the neuron's job is to transmit messages in the brain. And it happens lightning fast, faster than the speed of light, so that you're not even aware that this is happening. So what I'm about to show you is significantly slowed down, but essentially, if someone says something to you, your brain processes that, right? And maybe they tell you some good news as an example. So what happens is, let's see if I can get it to do that. So it's an impulse. So you hear something, so that's the impulse. And those little colored dots are what we call neurotransmitters. They're brain chemicals that move these impulses or these ideas or these thoughts from one neuron to the next neuron. And then, as you can see, the impulse travels forward to the next neuron and the next neuron and the next neuron. And so that's a perfectly normal way for neurons to behave in your brain, right? So again, so you start in that presynaptic nerve, and you've got these colored discs, which in this case are neurotransmitters. You have a thought and an impulse. It forces these neurotransmitters to move across that thing called a synapse and move into the next, the postsynaptic neuron, and then the impulse travels forward. So enough of that, let's move on to the next slide. So what happens after that impulse? What happens to the neurotransmitter that's floating around in that thing called the synapse, in that little space? So what happens is what we call reuptake. So after the message or impulse is sent, whatever neurotransmitter is left in the synapse is taken up by that presynaptic neuron. So those are the two slides I've just showed you is normal brain function. But what happens when we introduce something like gambling, in this case, winning at gambling? So what happens is, rather than a normal reuptake, here's what happens. So as you'll notice, the neurotransmitter, those brain chemicals, not a lot of it gets reuptaked into the presynaptic nerve. Most of it gets sort of pushed into the postsynaptic nerve, and the impulse increases in size and duration, right? So basically, how do you experience that as a human being? When you win at gambling, you go, woohoo, yay, I'm great, I'm rich, I'm rich, I'm rich, right? So you have that kind of experience, and people that have problems with gambling want to keep on re-experiencing that issue, right? And actually, over time, the more they engage in gambling, or the more they engage in sex, or the more they engage in eating too much food, or whatever it is that they're engaged in that's a non-substance related activity, it's going to increase that happening over and over and over again. And as I said earlier, the brain begins to become convinced that they need that extra impulse. They need that extra neurotransmitter in the postsynaptic nerve. And so that prompts the person to frequently, over time, to keep on doing that activity. Now, one thing that I need to also address is that these are genetic problems, right? So just like alcoholism and cocaine addiction and heroin addiction, we understand that someone can have what's called a genetic predisposition. So they might have like maybe a relative has had issues with alcohol or issues with other substances, and that gets passed down from generation to generation. Well, this is true also for these other inclinations. So that's kind of what happens in the brain with regard to this stuff. So let's talk a little bit of specifically, I've been talking a lot about gambling. And by the way, the reason why you've probably heard more about gambling than anything else in this presentation so far is because there's so much more data, there's so much more research that's been done, because frankly, it's taken us time to figure out that these other activities that I'm going to review can be problematic in a similar way to things like alcohol use disorder. So one of the things that happens is something called tolerance, right? So basically tolerance says that you need more and more of the same thing to get the same effect you used to get with just a little bit of that thing. So maybe you used to bet maybe once a month, but over time you need to bet more and more to get that same rush, that same, again, we talked about not chasing a high. People that have a gambling issue or challenges with gambling, they tend to sort of chase that feeling that, woohoo, I won, I'm rich, right? They love that increased impulse. But over time, they need to gamble more and more to get the same effect. And so then they start doing things like betting more than they originally intended. Like maybe they said to themselves at the beginning of the evening, I'm just only going to spend, I can only afford to spend $200. If I spend more than that, I'm not going to be able to pay my bills. But what happens is that desire to chase the high, to get that high up feeling, that urge overpowers the logic that they need to spend less so they can pay their bills, right? So that they begin to really not think logically about anything, and they just keep on betting to get that great feeling. And chasing losses, betting beyond your ability to pay, which I just was talking about. And then what happens if for some reason, maybe it's work commitments or family commitments, and they don't get to gamble? Well, then what happens is they start feeling really, really irritable and kind of get nasty towards their kids, their spouse, whoever it is that they're in contact with. Maybe it's with coworkers or even their boss, that they start really not being, even get aggressive, right? They might even be a little combative, whereas before they started gambling in this problematic way, they weren't having aggressive tendencies at all. And then they also become really preoccupied, like even when they're supposed to be doing other things like going to church or synagogue or doing something with it, going to a kid's softball game. Well, they're sitting there with their phone, and because now, there's FanDuel and all these online betting apps, they're on the phone betting on the betting app rather than paying attention to their kid's softball game. So they get really preoccupied with gambling to the exclusion of other important activities. And that's why the functioning starts decreasing, right? Because they're not paying attention to anything else but that activity of gambling. So let's switch gears and we'll talk briefly about food addiction. So a lot of you, like I said, might have asked at the beginning, well, food's a substance, what the heck's the difference? And why would you even cover this? So earlier I said, thank you for teaching me stuff. So there's been lots of back and forth and controversy about this idea of food addiction. There was a fairly long period during the course of my career where we did not associate eating disorders at all with addictive tendencies. But the more we studied the brain, those slides that I showed you as an example, the more we looked at what was going on in the brain with regard to food, is the more we began to realize, and also what people were reporting to us, we began to realize that while not all eating disorders are related to this addictive cycle that people get into, but there are really two disorders in particular that are related to food addiction. One of them is bulimia nervosa. Some of you may have heard of that. That's when a person either takes laxatives or induces their own vomiting so that they get rid of the food that they've eaten. So they'll binge on a lot of food, particularly foods that they favor, like lots of Oreos and high carb kinds of foods. And then they'll engage in these activities that that basically help them get rid of the food, right? So bulimia nervosa is one, that has sort of an addictive nature to it. In other words, the person can't stop of their own volition. They can't say, I got to abstain from this activity. They really have, they have that phenomena that I mentioned of tolerance. So they need more and more of their favorite foods, Oreos or whatever it is they love, M&Ms, and they need more and more of those to attain the same euphoric feeling they used to get with less of those foods. And then the other piece is people that overeat, right? So, so there's something called overeating disorder. And those are people that, may or may not appear overweight to you, right? So not everyone eliminates like people with bulimia nervosa, but people do engage in binge eating. So maybe they'll just eat tons during the weekend when maybe they wouldn't be observed by others, but then kind of watch themselves during the week. So not all people with this problem are overweight. I think sometimes when we think of food addiction, we think of someone who's eating so much that they're going to become overweight and become obese. That is not the case. While certainly some people with this disorder definitely become overweight, not everyone does. But the things that are really indicative of this problem is eating when you're not hungry. Plenty of us who don't have an eating disorder eat when we're not hungry. If someone wants to give me buttered popcorn or ice cream, I don't care if I'm not hungry. I love those foods and I'll eat them anyway. But then I tend to think the next day, well, I have to behave myself a little bit better because I really went overboard yesterday. But I don't have to do a lot of that kind of compensating to maintain a reasonable weight and not to be, I don't make a habit of eating when I'm not hungry. And also something that's really indicative is just horrible feelings of disgust and low self-esteem and thinking that you're the worst person in the world. And of course, as I said earlier, like as is the case with all of these non-substance related disorders, is functioning becomes really problematic, and particularly with people with eating disorders, even if they're not like those anorexic folks who are starving themselves, they are still doing some really bad things to their physical self. For instance, if you're inducing vomiting, you're affecting your tooth enamel. You might have red and very sore knuckles, because if you're putting your hand in your mouth to try and induce vomiting, it's going to affect the skin on your hands. And of course, it also is going to affect your entire gastrointestinal tract, because you're asking it to do things it shouldn't be doing, and that's really unhealthy. So again, early stage research indicates there is an overlap between eating disorder and food addiction appears to be distinct from other eating disorders, such as binge eating disorder, which I mentioned earlier. So I have a citation on that. If anyone's interested in doing a little bit more research, I can go ahead and email Roseanne and she can send that out for you. So we're going to just review one other non-substance related addiction, because I'm looking at the time. I have about 22 minutes left before we're done, and I want to make sure I cover also some of the solutions to these problems. So screen addiction, as you saw in some of the earlier slides, has really increased something like by a quarter in the time since the pandemic started, significantly so. So tolerance, again, looks slightly different with these folks. So they're spending more and more time on screen and online, with their social media, with, internet gaming. And I don't mean gambling gaming, but games, you've probably seen a lot of these like war type games and things like that, and strategy games, and minds. I think there's something called Mindscape or something of that nature, where you actually build your own town or whatever it is. And people kind of get lost in these games, and in some cases, they'll disguise themselves as someone else. They'll develop an avatar. So let's say if I were doing one of these online games, I might select an avatar. Like I might choose to be a much younger woman with blonde hair and very curvaceous, which of course is not what I look like now. So, people kind of disguise, they sort of get addicted to this idea of being someone else, being a different identity on screen. And therefore, they're not connecting with others as themselves. They're connecting with others as this sort of fantastical being that they've made themselves into. So, and they become kind of isolated, if they're in this sort of fantasy world, they're not going to be relating very well to the real world, right? Because it's so much not, for those of you who've ever played the lottery just once or twice, you get into this dream idea about what kind of house you'd have if you won, several $1 million, or what kind of trips you'd take and what kinds of fun things you would do. Well, these are people that are doing that kind of escapism every day of the week, many hours a day, and they lose contact with reality. So this is a really specific issue with people that have a screen use disorder. And also, and I think this might be true for some of the other disorders that I've discussed, is they get kind of caught in lying about what they've been doing and where they've been, because sometimes people do this stuff while they're supposed to be at work on their computer at work, and they kind of go off and live in their little fantasy world for a while. And then when the boss says, why didn't you get this report to me? They'll make up some lie about, my other supervisor told me I had to do this, and so I didn't have time for what you asked me to do, or whatever lie that they're going to tell. Problem with lies like that is they almost always get caught. And of course, as I've been alluding to, the people that have this particular problem with screen addiction are really the chief component is this idea of escaping, becoming another being, becoming, living in a different world or a fantasy world or an idealized world. So that's kind of where we're at with screen addiction. One thing I want to share with you, though, this is an important thing to be aware of really for all of these just non-substance related disorders, is you may want to think of it as an adaptation. Now, it might be a maladaptation, it might be maladaptive in nature, but almost all of the people that engage in these activities are trying to use the word at the bottom of this screen, escape from something. They're looking to get away from something that's unpleasant. And in particular, I actually read a book called Universal Play by a young man, and I know he's young because I saw his picture, and I know that he's a young man. His name is Alex Chris, and the book he wrote is about specifically people with this last addiction that I've reviewed with you, screen addiction, and how a lot of times the people that engage in these activities have issues in their home environment or issues in their relationships that in some cases they're actually trying to work out living in this fantasy world. Unfortunately, because they're losing contact with reality, it becomes a maladaptation rather than something that is a positive adaptation. So I thought that was a very interesting study and a take on all of these non-substance related disorders, because no one says, I really want to have trouble with screen addiction, or I really want to have an issue with gambling. People get lost in these things because they're trying to feel better. And guess what? All those statistics about the increase in these problems during the pandemic, the world has been a really difficult place to live in for the last 2 to 3 years between the pandemic, war in Ukraine, all of these issues, inflation, political unrest, all of these January 6th. I mean, there's been all of these really upsetting, jolting things, and it's really helpful to have some sort of healthy adaptation like meditation or yoga or, healthy, warm, happy relationships. And unfortunately, sometimes people stumble into other things that are not as helpful as the ones that I just mentioned. So that's kind of a possible reason why people engage in these activities. So how do we end the chase, right? How do we stop chasing these things? I promised I would give you some solutions. I'll spend about 5 to 10 minutes max on that. So one thing that I'm going to talk about briefly is something called harm reduction. So it is not a treatment approach, but it is a sort of a theoretical construct. It's a way to think about helping people. And you can read what's here on the screen, but essentially, as an example of what harm reduction is, some of you may remember that we had a pretty bad epidemic before we ever had this pandemic. It was an HIV and AIDS epidemic, particularly not just in the gay community, but it certainly started in the gay community. And frankly, this idea of harm reduction came out of what we did to try and solve the HIV and AIDS problem. So things like offering people clean needles and offering people condoms and ways to have safe sex so that they were not passing along these sexually this is largely a sexually transmitted disease. So we were finding ways for people to have safer sex, to have, if they must use substances, using a needle, at least use a clean needle, and clean works. So that's an example of harm reduction. And, just having a chat with people about health in general is better than not having a talk with them at all and sort of leaving them to their own devices. So harm reduction in the instance of these problems that we've been talking about looks slightly different. So for instance, I know that you're not, the people on this call are not clinicians necessarily, but we want to sort of find out from the person, have a chat with them and say, well, how much are you gambling and how often are you gambling? Oh, every day and half the day. Oh, that's a lot. Do you think maybe you could reduce the time that you spend, right? And actually, I think the next bullet talks about how much money you spend. So can you spend less? Can you try and budget yourself? So in other words, we're not asking the person to stop completely, stop what you're doing, go to treatment, just stop it, right? If these people could stop it easily, they would have on their own without any help from anybody. But, as a friend, if you're talking about someone who's worried about, geez, I feel like I'm gambling too much, you may want to say, well, tell me about that. Are you, how much are you gambling? How often and how much money are you using? And you may propose to them, well, do you think maybe you could try and cut back a little bit? And frankly, in asking them to do that, they may find out that they can't cut back, and that will reinforce for them, this seems like a problem I should get some help for. And, what are out of bounds activities? So, one out of bounds activity is to use my kid's college fund to gamble, as an example, right? So that you might set some, so you might say to your friend, well, let's set some parameters around your gambling. At least don't spend this pocket of money, or at least don't go out during the week, maybe only on the weekends, right? So kind of putting a frame or some boundaries around what they're doing. And also just, just revising the plan, every time you see them, you can say, so how are things been going? Have you been able to do what we talked about, right? And then if not, maybe the revision of the plan is, I'm not a clinician. I don't think I'm helping you. Would you be open to going to treatment? So that might be a conversation you have. So harm reduction, so that's how harm reduction might work. The bottom line is engaging a person with these problems. And I talked about gambling, but it could be eating, it could be screen time, it could be sexual addiction, which is a little harder to talk about with folks because they feel more private about it. But just sort of engaging them in a conversation and finding, helping them find out what if any limits they can place on themselves, and thereby reducing harm. So on the flip side, I mentioned that it's really hard to abstain, right? If people with these problems could abstain, right, just because they want to, they wouldn't need treatment, they wouldn't need help from anybody. But indeed, if someone decides, I'm spending all the money that I have on internet gaming, or I'm having some health issues related to my eating disorder, or I'm having, I'm not spending enough time with my family because I'm on the internet so much in this fantasy world. So they decide that really I've got to give this stuff up. So there's all kinds of things that they can do to promote and support being abstinent from these activities. So certainly getting individual counseling, engaging in groups, maybe in support groups. So there's Gamblers Anonymous, there is Internet Addiction Anonymous. So there are 12-step recovery groups. There's also Smart Recovery for folks with non-substance related disorders. Smart Recovery is different from 12-step recovery because they don't really talk about a higher power, whereas 12-step recovery does. And they also have trained facilitators, whereas AA and other 12-step recovery don't have any kind of trained facilitators. And of course, family counseling is important, right? Because the family maybe is feeling abandoned because these people have been so involved in these activities that the family might want some help, and get an opportunity to tell their loved one, here's the impact that your engagement in these activities has had on our shared lives. So some other just approaches. I use a really simple phrase when I describe cognitive behavioral therapy. Cognitive behavioral therapy is thinking your way into good behavior and behaving your way into good thinking. That really oversimplifies cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a whole approach to treatment that is research-based. There's like tons of research to say that it is an evidence-based approach to treatment, as is the second one, dialectic behavioral therapy. They're similar, but the thing that characterizes dialectic behavioral therapy is it really is specific for people to help regulate their emotions a little better. It helps people to tolerate distress. So when someone's sort of withdrawing, they've been forced to stop gambling as an example, it helps them tolerate that withdrawal period a little better to have this kind of treatment. And it also helps them improve their interpersonal relationships. So it might be dialectic behavioral therapy might be a perfect approach for one of these folks that are involved in all this screen addiction, is it helps them reconnect with people. Seeking safety is specifically designed for people who have experienced trauma and also struggle with substance and non-substance related disorders. So seeking safety is specifically for people that have experienced trauma. So maybe a Holocaust survivor who also is engaging in some of these other activities might be a good person for seeking safety, or someone by virtue of their gambling had some sort of traumatic event, like someone came at you, beat them up because they owed a lot of money. So so seeking safety might be really helpful for folks like that. Didactic is what I'm doing right now, is teaching, right? Is just teaching people about the impact of their activities on themselves and the people they care about. Case management might look different. So I mentioned that people get into legal trouble when they are involved with certainly someone who's very involved with pornography, as an example, can get into legal trouble. And so part of helping that person might help them, might be helping them navigate the legal system. People with eating disorders need maybe a nutritionist to help them set up a more healthful diet. So there's a lot of ways that case management can be helpful. I don't know a lot about medications that are used for these problems. One that pops into my mind that I am aware is used for these non-substance related disorders is an antidepressant. It's called an atypical antidepressant, and it's called Wellbutrin. There are others like that, Cymbalta, that are helpful, and also some of the antidepressants like Lexapro and Prozac can also be useful. But Wellbutrin in particular, some of you may be aware that it's also used for smoking cessation. So Wellbutrin has had a lot of evidence-based research that really has proven that it can be effective in treating these problems. So the last two bullets, I'm actually going to, forgive me, I'm going to actually read about them because they're very specific things. The self-exclusion program is actually in July 2002, so long before the pandemic. The Illinois Gaming Board launched a statewide casino voluntary self-exclusion program for problem gamblers that allows persons who have determined they are problem gamblers to self-exclude themselves from these casinos. So essentially they try and go through the door at a casino, and if they put their name down to buy chips or whatever to gamble with, they'll be reminded that, well, you're in this self-exclusion program. And then on June 28th, 2019, so actually right around the time that the pandemic, began to it was probably before the pandemic started, the Sports Wagering Act was signed into law. The Sports Wagering Act requires that the board's self-exclusion program for sports wagering be incorporated into the already existing program for casinos. And then that last one, problem gambling registry, you can actually voluntarily put yourself on a registry that would, help exclude you from any of these activities that might be problematic for you. So that pretty much covers all the material that I wanted to cover with you today. I'm going to kind of stop share here and rejoin my friend Roseanne. I see that we didn't gain many more participants.
No.
Yeah, so I did a lot of talking, but for a few people, which is hopefully useful. I see there was one thing in the chat. Anything that I need to be helpful?
So that was a comment that I had made to you, Nina, and I'm gonna go ahead and just start to wrap us up. Although we didn't have many people live in the audience today, we do put this on the website and the program will be there. So I'm hopeful that more people will be able to take advantage of the program where it is. And lots of content, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much. And then just to put in a pitch for our next program, it will be in January. It's on January 13th. And two of our CJE senior life therapists will be talking, Lisa Andrews and Kate Malley. We'll be doing a program on building self-compassion through mindfulness.
Oh, nice.
And with that said, thank you so much, Nina. It's always a pleasure.
Back at you, Roseanne. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And I had fun. I weren't a lot of people here, but I had fun. So thanks for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon.